They told a decorated Marine he didn't belong at his own son's graduation. 10 minutes later, 5 retired Navy SEALs walked through the doors and silenced an entire auditorium without saying a word. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The polished oak doors of the Thornton Academy auditorium gleamed under the bright June morning sun, reflecting the anxious, excited faces of parents arriving for the graduation ceremony. Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Gunny Johnson, retired, stood a little apart from the main throng, his posture erect despite the slight ache in his left knee, a memento from a Fallujah rooftop decades ago. He clutched a small, neatly wrapped gift for his son, Ethan, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. Today was a monumental day. Ethan, his only child, was graduating as valedictorian, a culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice, not just by Ethan, but by Marcus too, who had raised him single-handedly after losing his beloved Sarah. He wore a simple, well-pressed navy blue suit, a tie knotted with military precision. His shoes shined to a mirror finish. He wasn't one for ostentation, but today, he wanted to look his best for Ethan. He approached the main entrance, where 2 security guards in crisp, Academy-issued blazers were checking invitations. They were young, barely older than Ethan, with an air of self-importance that often accompanied new uniforms and a little authority. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. He offered his invitation, a gold-embossed card bearing Ethan's name and his own as invited guest. The first guard, a thin young man with a name tag reading Miller, barely glanced at it. His eyes flickered over Marcus, from his dark skin to his neatly trimmed but graying hair, lingering for a moment on a faint scar that traced along Marcus's temple. "Hold on a minute," Miller said, his tone dismissive. He nudged his partner, a heavier-set guard named Henderson. "Take a look at this." Henderson ambled over, chewing gum with an open mouth. He took the invitation from Marcus, turned it over, then looked Marcus up and down with an expression that bordered on insolence. "Name?" Henderson grunted. "Marcus Johnson," Marcus replied, keeping his voice even, though a familiar knot of frustration began to tighten in his chest. He'd faced this kind of scrutiny before, in countless situations where his appearance seemed to invite suspicion rather than acceptance. "Invitation says Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson," Miller interjected, a sneer in his voice. "You a Master Gunny?" He looked at Marcus's civilian suit, as if it were an affront. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Retired," he said quietly. "United States Marine Corps." Henderson chuckled, a short, unpleasant sound. "Right, and I'm a commandant." "Look, sir," he said, the sir an insult in its delivery. "We have a list. And your name, Marcus Johnson, isn't on our primary guest list for special seating. Valedictorian's father should be on that list." "My son is Ethan Johnson, the valedictorian," Marcus explained patiently. "This is his invitation. Perhaps there's a mistake with your list." Miller shook his head. "No mistake on our end, pal. List is the list. You can wait over there." He gestured vaguely toward a roped-off area some distance away. "And if there's space after all the priority guests are seated, maybe we can let you in. Can't make any promises." The humiliation was a sudden, cold weight. To be treated like an interloper, a potential troublemaker, at his own son's graduation, the proudest day of his life. He thought of the years of scrimping and saving, the extra shifts he'd pulled after retiring from the Corps to afford Thornton's tuition, the late nights helping Ethan with homework, the quiet pride he felt watching his son grow into such a fine young man. And now this, 2 young guards, full of their own petty power, barring his way. He saw other parents, mostly white, immaculately dressed, breezing past with polite nods from the guards, their invitations barely inspected. The contrast was a bitter pill. He took a deep breath, fighting back the surge of anger, the old warrior's instinct to meet aggression with overwhelming force. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was Ethan's day. He wouldn't mar it with a confrontation. "There must be some misunderstanding," Marcus said again, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Could you please check again? Or perhaps call one of the school administrators." Henderson leaned back, crossing his arms. "Look, we're busy. We've got our orders. No name, No entry to the priority section. You could try general admission later, if you behave. The condescension was palpable. Marcus felt the eyes of other parents on him, a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. He stood there, a decorated veteran, a father filled with pride, reduced to a nameless, suspect figure by two young men in ill-fitting blazers. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. The injustice of it was a sharp, metallic taste in Marcus's mouth. He had faced down enemy fire, led men through hell and back, endured hardships that would make these young guards crumble. Yet here he was, on one of the most important days of his life, being treated like a trespasser. The knot in Marcus's chest tightened. He was a man of immense discipline, his entire adult life forged in the crucible of the Marine Corps, where respect was earned and orders, when legitimate, were followed. But this felt like neither. This felt like a deliberate slight, a casual dismissal of his dignity. Young men, Marcus began, his voice low and steady, a tone that had once commanded the attention of hundreds of battle-hardened Marines. I assure you, I am Ethan Johnson's father. This invitation is valid. I would appreciate it if you would simply verify my identity with a school official. I am certain this can be cleared up quickly. Miller rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. Yeah, everyone's got a story. We've heard 'em all. My son's the quarterback, my daughter's the head cheerleader. Rules are rules. No special treatment. Henderson chimed in, his voice laced with a smug superiority. Look, Pops, maybe you should have called ahead if you thought you were someone important. Thornton Academy has standards. We can't just let anyone wander into the VIP seating. The word Pops grated on Marcus's nerves, a disrespectful diminutive that underscored their contempt. He thought of the sacrifices he'd made, the years he'd poured into ensuring Ethan could attend a place like Thornton, a place that supposedly prided itself on excellence and integrity. And these were its gatekeepers? He saw Mrs. Albright, a prominent local businesswoman whose son was also graduating, sweep past. She gave Marcus a cursory, dismissive glance as Henderson and Miller waved her through with obsequious smiles. The double standard was blatant, a stark reminder of unspoken biases that still permeated even supposedly enlightened institutions. Marcus pulled out his wallet, a worn leather affair that had seen him through 3 tours of duty. He extracted his retired military ID, the gold eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marine Corps emblem clearly visible. This is my official United States Marine Corps retired identification card. Master Gunnery, Sergeant Marcus Johnson. It matches the name on the invitation. Will this suffice? Miller took the card, his eyes widening slightly as he registered the rank. Master Gunnery Sergeant was the highest enlisted rank in the Corps, a position of immense respect and responsibility. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of doubt in the young guard's eyes. But Henderson, perhaps feeling his authority challenged, quickly intervened. He snatched the ID from Miller's hand. Military ID? What's it got to do with his school graduation? This isn't a base, you know. And frankly, he leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially, but loud enough for Marcus to hear clearly. Anyone can get one of those things made up these days. We need to see you on our list. Period. The implication was clear. They didn't believe him. They thought he was a fraud, perhaps trying to gate-crash an exclusive event. The insult was profound. Marcus's hand clenched into a fist at his side. A lifetime of discipline, the only thing keeping him from reacting in a way he would later regret. He took a slow, calming breath. I understand you have procedures, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. But your procedure is currently preventing me from seeing my son graduate as valedictorian. I am asking you, respectfully, to find a supervisor, to make a phone call, to perform the due diligence your position requires beyond simply staring at a flawed list. A small crowd was beginning to gather, curious onlookers drawn by the hushed but intense confrontation. Marcus felt their stares, the weight of their silent judgment. He hated being the center of such negative attention, especially here, especially today. He wanted this to be about Ethan, about his son's triumph, not about his own humiliation. Henderson seemed to puff up with importance at being the center of a minor drama. Are you questioning our competence, sir? he asked, the sir now laden with sarcasm. Because if you are, that's a different problem. Maybe you're the one who needs to speak to a supervisor about disturbing the peace. The threat was thinly veiled. They were trying to intimidate him into backing down, into accepting their arbitrary decision. Marcus looked past them, towards the grand entrance of the auditorium, hearing the distant strains of the school orchestra tuning up. Ethan would be in there, nervous, excited, probably wondering where his father was. The thought spurred him on. He couldn't let these two petty tyrants rob him of this moment, rob Ethan of having his father there. I'm not disturbing the peace, Marcus stated, his voice like chilled steel. I'm a father attempting to attend his son's graduation, and I will not be turned away by incompetence or prejudice. The word prejudice hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Miller flushed, and Henderson's eyes narrowed into slits. This was escalating, and Marcus knew it, but he had reached a point where backing down felt like a betrayal of himself, of Ethan, of every principle he had ever stood for. Inside the vast, ornate auditorium of Thornton Academy, Ethan Johnson adjusted his valedictorian sash, his heart a nervous drum against his ribs. He scanned the rows of assembled parents, faculty, and students, searching for one familiar, reassuring face. His father wasn't in their assigned seats, prime spots near the front reserved for the families of honor students. A frown creased Ethan's brow. His dad was never late, especially not for something this important. Punctuality was practically a religion for the retired master gunnery sergeant. He'd probably just gotten caught in traffic, Ethan told himself, though a small worm of unease began to wriggle in his stomach. His father had been so excited, so proud. They'd talked about this day for years. Ethan remembered his father sitting with him at the kitchen table late into the night, patiently explaining complex math problems or proofreading essays, his presence a steady, unwavering source of support. Marcus hadn't had an easy life. He joined the Marines young, seeking discipline and direction, and found calling. He'd served with distinction, seen things no one should ever have to see, lost friends, endured hardships. And through it all, his love for Ethan, and for Ethan's late mother, Sarah, had been his anchor. After Sarah passed, Marcus had become both father and mother, a difficult balancing act for a man used to the rigid structures of military life. But he'd done it with a quiet strength and a fierce, protective love that Ethan sometimes felt he didn't deserve. Thornton Academy had been a huge financial stretch. Marcus had worked 2, sometimes 3, part-time security jobs after his retirement to make it happen, always insisting that Ethan deserved the best education possible. "You've got the brains, son," Marcus would say, ruffling Ethan's hair. "My job is to make sure you have the opportunity to use them." And Ethan had worked hard, driven by a desire to make his father proud, to validate those sacrifices. Today, as valedictorian, he felt he had finally achieved that. His speech was tucked into his gown pocket, its words carefully chosen to express his gratitude, especially to his father. He imagined his dad's proud smile, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners, maybe even a rare tear that he'd quickly brush away. The thought made Ethan smile. But where was he? The orchestra struck up the processional march. Students began to file into their seats. The unease in Ethan's stomach grew. Back outside, Marcus was acutely aware of the passing time. The music was a clear signal that the ceremony was about to begin. The thought of Ethan looking for him, of his son standing up to give his speech without his father in the audience, was a fresh stab of pain, more potent than any personal insult the guards could hurl. "Please," Marcus said, his voice losing some of its steely edge, replaced by a note of raw urgency. "The ceremony is starting. My son will be looking for me. Isn't there anyone, a teacher, an administrator, anyone you can call?" Henderson smirked. "Should have thought of that before you showed up without being on the list, shouldn't you? Maybe your son forgot to invite you properly." The cruelty of that remark, the implication that Ethan was somehow at fault, or that Marcus wasn't truly wanted, was a low blow. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, drawing on reserves of patience he didn't know he possessed. He pictured Ethan's face, his bright, intelligent eyes, the way he'd looked up to him as a child, full of unquestioning love and admiration. He had to get in there. He couldn't fail him. Not today. He decided on a different tack. "All right," he said, forcing a calmer tone. "Perhaps I can speak to the head of security. Or the principal, Dr. Abernathy. I met him briefly at a parent-teacher conference last year. I'm sure he would remember me." Miller scoffed. "Dr. Abernathy? He's a very busy man. He doesn't have time to deal with every Tom, Dick, and Harry who thinks they're entitled to special treatment." Marcus felt a flicker of desperation. He was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare, at the mercy of two young men who clearly relished their small measure of power and were either unwilling or unable to apply common sense or decency. He thought of the times he'd faced down far greater threats, of making life-or-death decisions in fractions of a second. And now, he was stymied by a clipboard and a bad attitude. The irony was not lost on him. The weight of his responsibility to Ethan, the burning injustice of the situation, and the ticking clock of the approaching ceremony pressed down on him, a suffocating burden. Marcus remembered a piece of advice an old mentor, a grizzled first sergeant from his early days in the Corps, had once given him. "When you hit a brick wall, son, don't just keep banging your head against it. Look for a door, a window, or if you have to, find a way to go over or around." He scanned the area. The main entrance was clearly a lost cause with Miller and Henderson guarding it like Cerberus. Were there other entrances? Perhaps a side door, or a staff entrance he could try. But that would involve slipping away, acting furtively, which could be misconstrued and potentially create an even bigger problem if he were caught. It might also mean he'd miss Ethan's procession or his speech if he didn't find a seat in time. No, he needed to resolve this here, at the main point of entry, but he needed a different approach. He recalled his brief service in embassy security detail between combat tours. It was a different kind of warfare, one of protocol, diplomacy, and understanding chains of command. He remembered dealing with officious local guards at foreign posts, learning how to navigate their sense of self-importance without causing an international incident. Sometimes it wasn't about confrontation, but about finding the right lever. "All right, gentlemen," Marcus said, his tone shifting again, becoming less confrontational, more resigned, though his eyes still held a spark of determination. "I understand you have a job to do, and I'm not trying to make it difficult. But this is extremely important to me and to my son. Is there a senior security supervisor on duty today? Perhaps I could speak with them directly. They might have a more comprehensive list or the authority to make an exception if an error has occurred." Miller and Henderson exchanged a look. This was a more reasonable request, one harder to dismiss out of hand without appearing completely obstructive. Henderson grunted. "Sergeant Davies is the shift supervisor, but he's busy coordinating security for the whole event. I would be happy to wait until he has a moment," Marcus said patiently. "If you could just radio him and explain the situation. Father of the valedictorian, invitation in hand, name inexplicably missing from your list. I'm sure he'd want to resolve it." He was banking on the hope that a more experienced supervisor would have better judgment and access to more accurate information. As he spoke, Marcus's mind briefly flashed back to a dusty outpost in Anbar Province. He'd been a staff sergeant then, leading a patrol that had been ambushed. They were pinned down, taking heavy fire, communication spotty. Two of his young Marines were wounded. He remembered the desperate need to think clearly, to find a way out, to protect his men. He'd had to make a call then, a risky maneuver that involved flanking the enemy position through a narrow, exposed alleyway. It had worked, but it had been terrifying. This situation was different, of course. No lives were on the line, but the feeling of being trapped, of needing to find a solution against obstinate resistance, felt uncomfortably familiar. The quiet strength he had drawn upon then, he tried to summon now. He focused on Ethan, on the pride in his son's achievement, using it as an anchor against the rising tide of frustration. He wouldn't let this minor injustice overshadow the monumental achievement of his son. He had to believe that reason and decency would eventually prevail. Henderson, after a moment's consideration, unclipped his radio. "All right, fine," he grumbled. "But don't get your hopes up. Davies doesn't like his routine interrupted. He spoke into the radio, his voice still carrying a hint of his earlier arrogance, but also a new note of caution, perhaps realizing that stonewalling a potentially legitimate guest of honor might have repercussions. Marcus waited, his heart a little lighter. This was progress, however small. He just hoped Sergeant Davies was a man of reason. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The sound from the auditorium grew louder. The orchestra was now playing a prelude, the murmur of the assembled crowd a low hum. Ethan would be lining up with the other graduates, his moment approaching fast. Marcus clenched and unclenched his fists, trying to remain calm, trying to project an air of patient expectation rather than the simmering anger he still felt. He prayed this supervisor would be the key, the way around this unforeseen, unnecessary brick wall. Sergeant Davies, the security supervisor, finally arrived nearly 10 minutes later, his expression harried. He was an older man, probably ex-military himself, given his bearing, but his face was etched with the weariness of someone dealing with logistical headaches on a major event day. Henderson quickly recounted his version of events, emphasizing Marcus's persistence and their adherence to protocol. Marcus listened patiently. Then, when Davies turned to him, he calmly and concisely explained his situation, presenting his invitation and his retired military ID. "My son is Ethan Johnson, the valedictorian, Sergeant Davies," Marcus concluded. "I simply wish to be there to see him graduate. This is his invitation. My name is on it." Davies examined the invitation, then the ID, his brow furrowed. He looked at Marcus, a long, appraising look. Unlike his subordinates, there was no immediate dismissal in his eyes, but rather a careful consideration. "Master Gunnery Sergeant, retired," Davies said, nodding slowly as he read the ID. "That's a hell of a career, Gunny." He handed the ID back. "The list we were given by the administration office for priority seating is, well, let's just say it's had a few revisions. It's possible there was an oversight." This was the first glimmer of real hope Marcus had felt. Davies seemed like a reasonable man. However, Davies continued, his tone becoming more regretful. "The auditorium is now at capacity for reserved seating. The doors are closed for the procession. Even if I wanted to, I can't get you into that section now without causing a major disruption. Protocol is protocol once the doors are sealed for procession." Marcus's heart sank. So close, yet still so far. The orchestra inside swelled, playing the unmistakable strains of pomp and circumstance. The graduates were marching. Ethan was marching, and he was stuck out here. "But," Davies said, seeing the profound disappointment on Marcus's face, "there's a small overflow viewing room. It has a live video feed of the ceremony. It's not ideal, I know, but it's the best I can offer at this late stage. You'll be able to see and hear everything, and I'll personally escort you there." It was a compromise, a deeply unsatisfying one, but it was something. At least he wouldn't miss seeing Ethan, even if it was on a screen, even if he wasn't there in person to share that triumphant moment in the same room. The thought of Ethan not seeing him in the audience, not knowing his father was there at all, was still a painful one. "Thank you, Sergeant Davies," Marcus said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I appreciate your effort," as Davies led Marcus toward the side entrance, away from the disapproving glares of Miller and Henderson, who looked somewhat deflated that their authority hadn't been fully upheld. Marcus felt a profound sense of failure. He had fought battles, overcome incredible odds, and yet he couldn't even navigate the bureaucracy of a high school graduation to be there for his son in the way he'd envisioned. The overflow room was small, utilitarian, with a few rows of plastic chairs and a large television screen showing the live feed from the auditorium. A handful of latecomers and staff members were already there. Marcus took a seat in the back, the wrapped gift for Ethan resting on his lap. On the screen, he saw Ethan, tall and handsome in his graduation gown, walking proudly in the procession. A lump formed in Marcus's throat. His son, valedictorian. He should be in there, sharing that electric atmosphere, feeling the pride radiate through the crowd. Instead, he was here, in this sterile little room, watching a televised version of one of the most important moments of his son's life. The principal, Dr. Abernathy, was now at the podium, welcoming the attendees. His voice boomed through the speakers, full of platitudes about achievement and bright futures. Marcus barely heard him. His gaze was fixed on Ethan, who was now seated on the stage with the other honor students. Ethan scanned the audience, his brow furrowed, a fleeting expression of worry crossing his face. He was looking for him, and Marcus wasn't there. The pain of that realization was a physical ache. He had let his son down. Suddenly, a commotion at the main entrance of the auditorium, visible on the edge of the television screen, caught his attention. The live feed camera didn't pan over, but Marcus could hear a shift in the ambient sound from the auditorium, a ripple of surprise, then a sudden, profound silence that cut through Dr. Abernathy's speech mid-sentence. Dr. Abernathy himself looked up, startled, towards the back of the auditorium. What was happening? Even in the overflow room, the few people present looked at each other, puzzled. Then, the main doors of the overflow room burst open. Standing in the doorway of the small overflow room were 5 men. Not just any men. These were figures of an entirely different caliber than the Academy Guards. They were tall, lean, exuding an aura of quiet, coiled power that instantly commanded the attention of everyone present. They wore civilian clothes, smart, understated suits and collared shirts, but there was no mistaking their bearing. It was the unmistakable presence of elite special operators. Their eyes, sharp and assessing, swept the room before one of them, a man with strikingly keen blue eyes and silvering hair at his temples, met Marcus's gaze. There was a flicker of recognition in those eyes, then a slow, respectful nod that sent a jolt of surprise through Marcus. Did he know this man? Before Marcus could place him, the man spoke, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight that cut through the tinny sound of Dr. Abernathy's televised speech. Master Gunnery Sergeant Johnson, he asked, the title delivered with a precision and ingrained respect that Marcus hadn't heard directed at himself in years. It was the sound of one warrior acknowledging another. Marcus rose slowly from his plastic chair, a sense of unreality washing over him. The other occupants of the overflow room stared, wide-eyed and silent. Yes, Marcus replied, his voice a little hoarse. The tall man approached, the other 4 fanning out slightly behind him, a subtle but unmistakable protective formation that Marcus recognized instinctively. Commander Alex Mason, SEAL Team 3, retired, the man said, extending his hand. It's an honor, Gunny. We heard you were having a little difficulty gaining access to the main event. The other men with him, Marcus now noticed as they offered brief, respectful nods, had the same hard-edged, competent look. They weren't boys in blazers. These were men who had seen and done things most people couldn't imagine. Marcus shook Commander Mason's offered hand, his mind reeling. SEALs? Here? How do they even know? Commander Mason. Marcus managed, his astonishment evident. I don't understand. How? Mason offered a brief, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes but conveyed a world of understanding. Let's just say the military community is smaller than you think, Gunny. And word travels fast when one of our own is being disrespected, especially a legend like yourself. Legend? Marcus felt a flush creep up his neck. He had always considered himself just a Marine, doing his duty, nothing more. He certainly didn't see himself as a legend. We understand your son, Ethan, is the valedictorian, Mason continued, his tone all business again, but with an undercurrent of empathy. A fine achievement. He deserves to have his father witness it properly. Not from an overflow room, watching it on a television screen like a football game. He turned to the other SEALs, a silent communication passing between them. Gentlemen, Commander Mason said, his voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its authority. I believe it's time we rectified a significant oversight in Thornton Academy's hospitality and ensure that a father gets to see his son graduate from a seat he has more than earned. Without another word, Commander Mason turned and strode towards the doors leading from the overflow room into the corridor that connected to the main auditorium, the other SEALs falling in step behind him with a fluid, purposeful grace that was utterly captivating. Marcus, caught between disbelief and a dawning, incredulous hope, found himself following them. Sergeant Davies, the security supervisor who had escorted Marcus to the overflow room, looked on with an expression of utter bewilderment, as did the few other staff members present. They had no idea who these men were, but their air of quiet, indisputable command was unlike anything they had encountered from mere civilian guests. The procession moved quickly through the short corridor. As they reached the main doors to the auditorium, the very doors Marcus had been barred from earlier, the sounds of Dr. Abernathy's speech were clearly audible. Commander Mason didn't hesitate. He pushed open one of the heavy oak doors, and then the other, holding them for Marcus to pass through. The scene that greeted them as they stepped into the vast, hushed auditorium was one of utter, suspended animation. Dr. Abernathy was frozen mid-sentence at the podium, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with surprise. Every head in the hall, from the front row of dignitaries to the students on stage, was turned towards the entrance, a sea of shocked, questioning faces. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket smothering the usual rustle and murmur of a large gathering. The two guards who had caused Marcus so much grief, Miller and Henderson, were positioned just inside the main doors, their expressions shifting from bored arrogance to slack-jawed disbelief, and then to a dawning, palpable fear as they saw not only Marcus, but the 5 imposing figures accompanying him, striding into the auditorium as if they owned the place. This was not how graduations at Thornton Academy usually proceeded. The silence in the auditorium was so profound that the soft, measured tread of the SEAL's shoes on the carpeted aisle seemed to echo like thunderclaps. Commander Mason and his team didn't pause, didn't look left or right. They moved with a focused intensity, their eyes fixed on the front of the hall. Marcus, walking in their midst, felt a bewildering mixture of emotions. Embarrassment at the disruption, gratitude for this unexpected intervention, and a fierce, resurgent pride. He was no longer the supplicant, hoping for a bureaucrat's favor. He was being escorted, with undeniable authority, to witness his son's triumph. Dr. Abernathy, still at the podium, finally managed to close his mouth, though his expression remained one of utter bewilderment. He looked towards the school's head of security, Sergeant Davies, who had followed the group into the auditorium and now stood near the back, looking equally stunned and helpless. Davies could only offer a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if to say, "This is beyond my control." Miller and Henderson, the 2 young guards, had visibly shrunk against the auditorium wall near the entrance. Their earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a pasty-faced fear. They recognized Marcus, of course, and the men escorting him were clearly not ordinary guests. The sheer, unadulterated confidence and an almost tangible aura of danger these men exuded were unlike anything the 2 young guards had ever encountered. They suddenly looked like what they were, boys playing at being men, now faced with the genuine article. Commander Mason and his team didn't stop until they reached the front rows, the area reserved for VIPs and families of honor students, the very section Marcus had been so summarily denied access to. With a polite but unassailable firmness, Commander Mason addressed a couple seated in prime front row seats that, according to the original seating chart Marcus had seen with his invitation, should have been his. "Excuse me," Commander Mason said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "There appears to have been a seating error. These seats are reserved for the valedictorian's father." The couple, a portly man in an expensive suit and his elaborately coiffed wife, looked up, initially annoyed at the interruption. But one look at Commander Mason's steely gaze and the equally imposing figures flanking him was enough to quell any protest. They exchanged a nervous glance and, with mumbled apologies, quickly vacated the seats, scurrying to find alternative spots further back. One of the SEALs, a senior chief with a chest that looked as though it had been carved from granite, pulled out one of the now empty chairs with a flourish that was both respectful and subtly challenging to anyone who might still question their actions. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Johnson," Commander Mason said, turning to Marcus with a slight inclination of his head, his voice resonating with respect in the still silent hall. "Your seat, I believe. Front and center. As it should be." Marcus hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The sheer audacity of the moment, the unexpectedness of this powerful, almost cinematic intervention, nearly overwhelming him. Then, thinking of Ethan, thinking of the quiet dignity these men were so unexpectedly and forcefully restoring not just to him, but to the idea of respect itself, he straightened his shoulders. He walked the few steps to the offered seat, his heart pounding, and sat down. The 4 remaining SEALs didn't take seats themselves. Instead, in a move that sent a fresh wave of astonishment through the already stunned audience, they positioned themselves discreetly but with undeniable presence at the ends of the front rows and along the side aisles near the stage. They stood at ease, their hands clasped either in front or behind them, their expressions unreadable, but their posture exuding an unmistakable aura of vigilance, of quiet protection. They weren't just security. They were an honor guard, a silent, powerful testament to the man they had just escorted to his rightful place. On the stage, Ethan Johnson, who had been watching this entire drama unfold with wide, disbelieving eyes, felt a lump form in his throat. He saw his father, not relegated to an overflow room or a distant seat, but right there, in the front row, flanked by men who looked like they had stepped out of the pages of a Tom Clancy novel. The shame and worry he had felt moments before were utterly vanquished, replaced by a swelling pride, so immense it almost choked him. He didn't understand all the nuances of what had just happened, but he understood one thing with absolute clarity. These men were here for his dad, because his dad was someone important, someone deeply respected, someone whose honor they were prepared to defend, even in the hallowed, protocol-bound halls of Thornton Academy. Dr. Abernathy, the principal, still at the podium, finally found his voice, though it was several shades less confident and considerably more tremulous than before. Ladies and gentlemen," he stammered, attempting to regain some semblance of control over the proceedings. "It seems we have had some distinguished late arrivals who have now found their rightful places. Please, let us resume our celebration of these fine young graduates." But no one was truly looking at Dr. Abernathy anymore. All eyes were either on Marcus, now seated with quiet dignity in the front row, or on the imposing, silent figures of the SEALs who stood like sentinels. Whispers, no longer hushed, but buzzing with excited speculation, rippled through the crowd. Who was that man? And who, in heaven's name, were those men who had just orchestrated such a dramatic entrance? The carefully orchestrated decorum of the Thornton Academy graduation had been utterly and irrevocably shattered, not by an act of aggression, but by an act of profound, silent, and immensely powerful respect. Miller and Henderson, the 2 young guards who had so arrogantly barred Marcus's way, had practically melted into the wall near the auditorium entrance, their faces a ghastly shade of pale. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to their very marrow, that they had made a monumental, career-altering mistake. The casual cruelty, the petty abuse of their minimal authority, had blown up in their faces in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. Sergeant Davies, the security supervisor, stood near them, his expression a complex and unreadable blend of frustration at his subordinate's incompetence, a grudging admiration for the sheer audacity and efficiency of the SEALs' intervention, and a dawning understanding of the magnitude of the diplomatic and administrative blunder that had occurred. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that he would be answering some very difficult and uncomfortable questions from the school board and Dr. Abernathy later. Commander Mason, seeing Marcus seated and the immediate situation resolved, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Dr. Abernathy, a silent signal that the ceremony could, indeed, proceed. But the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The earlier complacency and self-congratulatory air of the Thornton Academy elite was gone, replaced by an electric awareness, a sense that something truly extraordinary, something deeply significant had just happened. Ethan, on stage, could barely contain the whirlwind of his emotions. He saw his father, his quiet, unassuming, hard-working father, now the focus of intense interest and respect, seated in the front row, flanked by men who radiated an almost mythical aura of competence and valor. The shame and worry he had felt for his father's absence were replaced by a swelling pride so immense it almost brought tears to his eyes. He didn't understand all the details, but he understood the core of it. These formidable men were there for his dad, because his dad was someone truly special, someone whose hidden worth they recognized and were determined to see honored. As the ceremony haltingly resumed, with various school officials and guest speakers attempting to regain the audience's full attention and stick to the planned program, the presence of the SEALs and the unspoken story of Marcus's initial exclusion continued to circulate in hushed, excited tones. Parents leaned over to whisper to each other, frantically texting contacts who might have more information, piecing together fragments of the unfolding drama. Their expressions shifted from simple curiosity to righteous indignation on Marcus's behalf, and then to a profound awe for the men who had so decisively intervened. The meticulously planned, self-important graduation ceremony of Thornton Academy had been unexpectedly and wonderfully humanized. When it was finally Ethan's turn to deliver his valedictory address, he walked to the podium not with the nervous energy of a student, but with a newfound confidence, a poise that seemed to channel the quiet strength of his father and the formidable presence of his father's unexpected champions. He looked out at the sea of faces, his gaze finding his father's in the front row. Marcus met his eyes, a small, proud smile on his lips, a look that conveyed a world of love, encouragement, and now, a shared understanding of a battle fought and won. Ethan took a deep breath. He had a prepared speech, one filled with the usual academic reflections, polite platitudes, and carefully curated thanks. But in that moment, looking at his father, at the silent, formidable men who stood as a testament to his father's true, often unseen, worth, Ethan knew he had to say something more, something real, something from the heart. He put his prepared notes aside on the lectern. Ethan Johnson stood at the podium, the expectant hush of the auditorium amplifying the beat of his own heart. He looked directly at his father, Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson, and a profound sense of love and fierce pride filled him. His carefully crafted valedictory speech, the one he had practiced for weeks, suddenly felt inadequate, hollow even, in the face of the raw, powerful display of respect and loyalty he had just witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the now utterly silent auditorium with an unexpected maturity. "Esteemed faculty, proud parents, and my fellow graduates. Today is a day of celebration, a day to look back on our achievements at Thornton Academy and forward to the bright futures that await us. And I had a speech prepared for that very purpose, filled with reflections on our time here and gratitude for those who helped us along the way." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience, a sea of faces now watching him with rapt attention, before returning, with unwavering focus, to his father. "But something happened today, something deeply personal yet profoundly public, that reminded me, and perhaps all of us, of what truly matters beyond academic accolades, beyond prestigious degrees, beyond the carefully constructed facades of success." A murmur of anticipation went through the crowd. They sensed this was no ordinary valedictory address. "It reminded me," Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction, "that true honor, true integrity, isn't always found in the spotlight, or emblazoned on a banner, or announced with a flourish of trumpets. Sometimes it's found in quiet dignity, in steadfast and often unseen service, in sacrifices made silently, without any expectation of reward or recognition. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, the greatest and most honorable among us are those who walk humbly through life, their true worth known only to a select few, or perhaps to none at all, until circumstances or the unwavering loyalty of true brothers reveal it." The SEALs, positioned around the front of the auditorium, stood impassively, their expressions unreadable, Yet Marcus thought he saw Commander Mason give a barely perceptible nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement of the young man's courage and insight. "My father," Ethan declared, his voice now thick with an emotion that resonated with everyone present, his eyes shining with unshed tears as he looked directly at Marcus. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson of the United States Marine Corps, retired, taught me everything I know about perseverance, about integrity, about the unwavering courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when you find yourself standing alone against the tide. He taught me that true character is not about the uniform you wear or the title you hold, but about what you do when no one is watching, and that genuine strength isn't measured by how loudly you can shout your own importance, but by how steadfastly you endure adversity and how honorably you live your life." A ripple of spontaneous applause started, soft at first, then quickly growing in volume and intensity, a heartfelt acknowledgement not just of Ethan's powerful words, but of the remarkable man who had inspired them. Marcus felt a warmth spread through him, a pride so intense it almost brought him to his knees. This was his son, his boy, standing before hundreds, speaking with such unshakable eloquence, such profound courage, such deep love. "Today," Ethan went on, his voice clear once more as the applause subsided, his words now carrying a sharper edge of righteous indignation. "My father, a man who has dedicated his life to the service of this nation, a man who has faced dangers most of us can only read about in books or see in movies, faced an obstacle simply trying to be here, to witness his son's graduation. He was met with disrespect, with bureaucratic indifference, with a callous refusal to acknowledge who he is, simply because his name wasn't on the right piece of paper, or because he didn't fit someone else's narrow, preconceived notion of importance. He, a man who has given more to this country, who has sacrificed more for the freedoms we all enjoy than most of us can ever truly comprehend, was made to feel unwelcome, an outsider, at his own son's proudest moment." The applause died down completely now, replaced by a stunned, deeply uncomfortable silence as the full import of Ethan's words sank in. Many in the audience exchanged uneasy, searching glances, some looking towards the back of the auditorium where the two disgraced guards, Miller and Henderson, were now trying to make themselves utterly invisible. Dr. Abernathy shifted uncomfortably in his prominent seat on the stage, his earlier composure visibly shaken. This was not the carefully sanitized, self-congratulatory event Thornton Academy had planned. Ethan Johnson, his voice resonating with a powerful blend of filial love and righteous anger, held the Thornton Academy auditorium captive. "But my father," he declared, his gaze unwavering as he looked at Marcus, "is not defined by how others may choose to see him, or by the petty indignities they may foolishly try to inflict upon him. He is defined by his unwavering actions, by his selfless service, by the quiet, unshakable honor he carries within him every single day of his life." And today, some of his brothers in arms, men of similar extraordinary valor and unyielding integrity, men who understand the profound meaning of loyalty, made sure that that honor was recognized, that that dignity was upheld. He gestured with an open hand towards Commander Mason and the other retired SEALs, who stood like granite statues, their very presence a testament to the values Ethan was so eloquently articulating. "These gentlemen," Ethan continued, his voice ringing with admiration, "true American heroes in their own right, saw an injustice, a profound disrespect, not just to a man, but to the ideals he represents, and they acted. They didn't do it for public display, or for personal thanks, or for any kind of recognition. They did it simply because it was the right thing to do. They did it because they understand, in their very bones, the sacred bonds of service, the deep meaning of respect, the unspoken debt we all owe to those who have stood on the ramparts and protected us, often from dangers we never even knew existed." The applause that erupted this time was thunderous, a sustained wave of sound that washed over the auditorium. A heartfelt ovation directed not only at Ethan for his courage and eloquence, but at Marcus for his lifetime of service, and at the five silent, formidable figures who stood as unequivocal sentinels of honor and brotherhood. Commander Mason allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. This was better than any formal reprimand to the school administration or any disciplinary action against the guards. This was public acknowledgement from the heart of the very family that had been wronged, a lesson in humility and respect delivered with far more power than any official decree. Ethan waited patiently for the applause to subside, his composure remarkable for one so young, his earlier nervousness completely gone, replaced by a calm, centered strength. So, as we, the graduating class of Thornton Academy, he concluded, his voice now resonating with a newfound maturity and a profound wisdom that belied his years, prepare to go out into the world, to pursue our dreams and build our futures. I hope we carry with us not just the academic knowledge we've diligently gained within these hallowed halls, but also the vital, unforgettable lesson that was so powerfully and unexpectedly demonstrated here today. The lesson of humility in the face of true greatness. The lesson of courage, not just on the battlefield, but in standing up for what is right in our everyday lives. The lesson of profound respect for all individuals, regardless of their perceived station, their outward appearance, or whether their name appears on some arbitrary list. He paused, his gaze sweeping over his fellow graduates, then returning once more to his father, his eyes now filled with an overwhelming love and gratitude. And finally, the enduring understanding that true leadership, true strength, and true heroism often were the most unassuming disguise, walking quietly among us, seeking no accolades, only the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with honor and integrity. Thank you. And thank you, Dad. This day, this speech, this honor, it's all for you. He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Marcus could no longer hold back his own. They streamed freely, unabashedly, down his weathered face, tears of immense pride, of profound relief, of overwhelming love for his extraordinary son, and for the unexpected, fierce brotherhood that had come to his aid and turned a moment of deep humiliation into a triumph of the human spirit. The standing ovation that followed Ethan's speech was the longest and most heartfelt of the entire ceremony. It was clear to everyone present that his words and the dramatic, unforeseen events that had preceded them had struck a profound and resonant chord, transforming a standard graduation into an unforgettable lesson in character, respect, and the enduring power of quiet heroism. Dr. Abernathy, when he finally regained the podium to officially conclude the ceremony, looked visibly chastened, his usual polished rhetoric replaced by a few simple, sincere words of thanks and a promise that Thornton Academy would learn from this day. The rest of the graduation ceremony proceeded, but the undercurrent of what had transpired, the unspoken acknowledgement of a deeper truth revealed, remained palpable. The distribution of diplomas, the traditional turning of tassels, all took place under the watchful, respectful gaze of the 5 retired Navy SEALs, a constant, silent reminder of the profound values that had been so powerfully and so publicly asserted. The air in Thornton Academy's auditorium, and perhaps in the hearts of many who were there, was forever changed. After the ceremony concluded and the graduates jubilantly tossed their caps into the air in a cascade of navy blue, a throng of well-wishers, classmates, and proud parents immediately surrounded Ethan Johnson. But his first move, without hesitation, was towards his father. He pushed through the congratulatory crowd and enveloped Marcus in a fierce, heartfelt hug, the kind that speaks volumes when words are inadequate. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion as he pulled back slightly. "I was so worried when I couldn't see you. I didn't know what had happened. And then, those men, who were they?" Marcus hugged him back, his own heart overflowing with a mixture of pride and profound gratitude. "Those men, Ethan," he said, his voice a low rumble of deep emotion, "are heroes, true American heroes and loyal brothers. And they came because sometimes even old master gunnery sergeants need a little help from their friends in the Navy to remind people what respect looks like." Commander Alex Mason and his team approached them then, their expressions now relaxed, even a hint of a smile playing on Mason's lips. "Ethan," Commander Mason said, extending his hand with a firm, warm grip, "that was one hell of a valedictory address. Your father has every right to be immensely proud of you. And frankly, so do we. You spoke truth to power today, young man, and you did it with courage and eloquence." Ethan shook his hand, then the hands of the other 4 SEALs, his eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and lingering disbelief. "Thank you, sir. Thank you all." The initial flurry of attention subsided. He gratefully faded back into his quiet, well-ordered life. But he was no longer just an anonymous retired Marine in his neighborhood. He was a symbol, a living reminder of quiet strength, enduring dignity, and the profound, unassailable respect that is due to all who have served their nation with honor. And sometimes, when the familiar ache in his knee was particularly troublesome on a damp morning, or when he looked at the gleaming compass he had given Ethan, now displayed proudly on his son's desk, he would remember the extraordinary sight of 5 retired United States Navy SEALs silencing a room, not with shouts or weapons, but with the sheer, undeniable, and awe-inspiring power of their respect for a Marine brother. And Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson, retired, would allow himself a small, satisfied smile. Justice, sometimes, has a way of arriving in the most unexpected and most impressive of uniforms, ensuring that true honor is not only remembered, but fiercely defended. If you believe that true honor deserves to be recognized and that the bonds of brotherhood and service are unbreakable, type Semper Fi in the comments below. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where we ensure that the quiet heroes among us are never forgotten, and their stories of courage, integrity, and resilience are always brought into the brightest light.